It's the world's favorite sweet. From Canada to Argentina to China, chocolate is regularly consumed by nearly everyone in developed nations, adding up to a global consumption of nearly 8 million tons. This, of course, means there's an obscene amount of money to be made, and indeed, as of 2023, the global chocolate industry is worth about $130 billion. But this lucrative market harbors a dark secret. Keeping the prices low on the shelves near you often comes at the hidden cost of exported child labor, generational poverty, deforestation, and a whole lot more. So today we're going to explore how hidden behind everyone's favorite treat is one of the darkest sides of corporate greed and exploitation, filled to the brim with heinous allegations, numerous cover-ups, and undisputed human rights violations. Now, as you may know, the main ingredients in making chocolate are cocoa beans. These beans come from pods that grow on cacao trees, which require a warm, humid climate to thrive, meaning that nearly all chocolate production happens near the equator. That's why the majority of these beans, more than 70%, are produced on the coast of West Africa. But cacao didn't always exist in Africa. Until a few hundred years ago, it could only be found in Mesoamerica, where cultures such as the Maya had been cultivating and consuming it for centuries. Cocoa beans were widely used as a form of currency in the region, and continued to be used to pay taxes to the Spanish once they'd colonized the area. And it was the Spanish who had introduced the treat to the rest of the world, first only bringing it back to Spanish elites and government officials, but as production expanded, it started becoming more widely available, and after 100 years or so, it had grown in popularity across much of Europe. An increased demand requires an increased supply, and so cocoa plantations began popping up in colonial territories. Enslaved Africans soon became the primary source for most of the cultivating process, which included growing the beans, picking them, and manually grinding them into a paste. In the early 1700s, a mechanical cocoa grinder was invented, and soon wind-powered mills and other inventions would speed the process up, leading to the mass production of chocolate. However, despite the technological advances, slavery was still at the heart of the production chain. It was during this market expansion, in the 1800s, that many chocolate giants were founded, such as Nestle, Hershey's, and Cadbury, all of which were relying on slave plantations to produce their goods. However, it was also around this time that the political scene in the Western world began to shift regarding slavery, as abolition movements began gaining majority support. Britain outlawed slavery in 1834, followed by France, 1848, and in the United States in 1865, along with many others around that time. Massive chocolate producers weren't too happy with this. If they had to do something as outrageous as pay their workers a fair wage, their profits were going to take a hit, and so cocoa production began to shift away from the Americas and into West Africa, where they were able to hide their morally questionable business from public scrutiny. It even had the added benefit of being overall cheaper to produce in Africa, leading to a large price drop in the early 1900s that saw chocolate's popularity soar, further keeping them in the public's favor. But they didn't completely avoid trouble. Cadbury fell into a bit of a scandal in 1905 when these plantations were discovered in Sao Tome, which at the time was under Portuguese control. Portugal itself had already abolished slavery, but they didn't really enforce it in their colonies, much less on the many small islands, so it was still widespread. This is one of the first scandals of post-abolition slavery in the chocolate world, and it even led to the owner of the company, William Cadbury, traveling there himself to see it firsthand, after which Cadbury announced they would no longer be purchasing cocoa beans grown in Portuguese colonies. Sadly, however, this would be far from the last of such incidents, and frustratingly, not even the last for Cadbury, but we'll get into that later. Despite this initial outrage, the media frenzy died down pretty quickly, and chocolate companies continued to purchase cocoa beans from slave plantations in West Africa for decades. Usually, stories like this wrap up by saying that due to international pressure or some new trade regulations, the exploitation and dependence on slavery actually eventually came to an end. However, that simply isn't the case with chocolate, and unknown to many customers around the world, the industry's horrific practices continue to this day. Now, the two countries that we'll be focusing on the most here are the Ivory Coast and Ghana, who together produce more than 50% of the world's cocoa beans. Especially in the case of the Ivory Coast, chocolate makes up a huge portion of their overall GDP, and a slight dip in the global cocoa market can be catastrophic for the local economy. Such is the situation when you heavily depend on a single export. In order to keep sales up, prices must stay competitive, and so plantation owners will make use of every cost-cutting measure available, which has led to the recruitment of children as workers. Child labor in itself is highly frowned upon around the world, as it takes away from a child's right to pursue an education and puts them at high risk of injury and just deprives them of childhood. But what's happening on many of these cocoa farms is not just a sketchy form of child employment, but is outright child slavery. In Ivory Coast and Ghana alone, approximately 2.1 million children work on cocoa farms, often working between 60 and 100 hours per week. Most often, their work involves using long, sharp tools to cut the pods off of trees, cutting the pods open to remove the cocoa beans, and then taking them to a facility where they'll dry the products or treat them with chemicals to ferment them. Protective clothing is essentially non-existent throughout this entire process, and injuries range from cuts to chemical burns to hernias from transporting the heavy bags of wet cocoa beans that can weigh upwards of 100 pounds. Sleeping arrangements often consist of nothing more than wooden planks in windowless shacks, providing no refuge from the region's many insects, and nutrition is about as bad as it can get, with minimal calories provided from the cheapest sources such as corn paste, or, for the lucky ones, bananas they find in the surrounding forest. Sanitary bathrooms and safe water sources are nowhere to be seen. Am I wondering how a kid ends up in this grueling situation in the first place? And the answer does vary. Many cross the border from the impoverished nations of Burkina Faso or Mali, looking for work or schooling options, and they end up stuck on a cocoa farm. One 15-year-old named Abo told the Washington Post that he had traveled from Burkina Faso when he was 10 years old looking for education opportunities, but had yet to even set foot in a school in Ivory Coast, as he was now forced to spend all of his time on the farm. Others still are in even worse circumstances, as instead of intentionally migrating to the nation looking for work or school, they may have been sold into the industry as slaves. This can happen in many ways, such as from a family who sells one of their children to a plantation, or from highly organized human trafficking rings. BBC reporters found that in one village in Burkina Faso, nearly every mother had lost a child to a cocoa trafficker. In Mali, traffickers posing as businessmen hang around busy bus stations looking for children that are alone, usually begging for money or food. After approaching them, their pitch line is often along the lines of, "Would you like a great job in Côte d'Ivoire? I can get you one." Children then forced to refer to the traffickers as aunts or uncles to avoid suspicion, and they cross the border into Ivory Coast to make a deal with a plantation. Undercover journalists found that a child can be sold to a cocoa farmer for around $34. Most victims are between the ages of 11 and 16, but children as young as 5 have been documented. Another way children are captured is through deception. One 12-year-old boy named Ali was promised a bicycle and $150 a year that he could send back to his family in Mali. Instead, he told reporters his only rewards were the rare days when he wasn't whipped with a chain or a tree branch for working too slowly. To quote him, "The beatings were a part of my life. Anytime they loaded you with bags and you fell while carrying them, nobody helped you. Instead, they beat you until you picked it up again." And his story of abuse is not unique. Flogging and verbal abuse are a daily occurrence for many, and anyone who attempts to escape receives the most severe of beatings, which in some instances have been known to be fatal. Oftentimes, children are sold by the trafficker for a set period of time, such as 2 years, but even when this tentative contract ends, they have no power to leave, and many are never able to return home. But the issue doesn't lie solely with the traffickers and the farmers who purchase the children. The greed and exploitation go all the way to the top of the chain, starting with local law enforcement, who rarely intervene and often only do so when under international public pressure, and even then, they do little to put an actual stop to things. Take, for example, a man nicknamed Le Gros. His business model involved locking trafficked children in a room with nothing but cans to urinate in until he could sell them to his favorite farm. During the bargaining, he would sell the children under the condition that they work for 12 hours a day, which he would ensure, since he would also remain on the farm as an overseer to ensure their productivity. In 2005, a boy escaped this farm, was captured, but managed to escape again and even crossed the border back into Mali. He told his local elders what had happened to him, and soon Mali's consul general in Ivory Coast was investigating the scene. He showed up with several police officers and detained the lead farmers, who had been forcing 19 total boys to work for them, the youngest of which was 13. The boys were freed, and medical examinations found that their bodies were covered in old and new scars, infected open wounds, and numerous fractures. The Gros was given several charges, including assault of a child and the suppression of liberty, to all of which he pled not guilty. To quote, "I've never ever laid hands on any one of my workers. Maybe I called them bad words if I was angry. That's the worst I did. When I go hunting, when I get a kill, I divide it in half. One for my family, and the other for them. And apparently, his charm worked. Despite the charges laid against him, each carrying a maximum punishment of 10 years in prison, Lagros only spent 24 days in a local jail and today is a free man, likely back in his old business. The reason he didn't receive much prison time probably has to do with the fact that the government of Ivory Coast has been known to cover up and protect slave owners for the income they bring to the country. In 2004, the security team of the Ivorian First Lady allegedly kidnapped and murdered a journalist who was reporting on the cocoa industry. In 2010, 3 more were detained for reporting about cocoa-related corruption. And then we get to the mega corporations that purchase the cocoa beans themselves. In 2001, huge scandals erupted when numerous reports exposed the slave labor at the core of the chocolate industry, incriminating giants like Nestle, Cadbury, Mars, Hershey's, Lindt, Godiva, Mondelez, Ferrero, and many, many more. Federal lawsuits were filed in the United States on behalf of 6 Malian children who had been rescued from the cocoa farms, and as a result, several of the companies agreed on a timeline to reduce and phase out child labor in their cocoa bean supply chain. The original goal was the complete eradication of child labor by 2005. But they quickly began scaling back their ambitions. They missed their deadline in 2008 and then another one in 2010. 2 decades after their original promise, the companies once again agreed to reduce child labor by 70% by the year 2020, which, as you probably can guess, didn't happen. It seems that the strategy of many of these companies is to make great public promises that everybody loves to hear, pushing Judgment Day a few years down the road until they can make another empty promise and hold a nice press conference about it. Another tactic of theirs is to constantly shift blame. Companies will often say something along the lines of not knowing exactly where the cocoa beans come from, since they just purchase them in bulk from a single provider that's detached from the farms. Essentially, out of sight, out of mind, not our responsibility. And finally, companies also like to exaggerate their own humanitarian efforts while downplaying the abuse. Leaked documents from a World Cocoa Foundation strategy meeting showed that the representatives of Nestle, Mars, and a few other companies wanted to focus their advertising and messaging on their accomplishments to appease the public without actually having to end the exploitation. And these powerful companies have a lot of influence on what gets published, such as a report from the National Opinion Research Center, or NORC, from the University of Chicago, which was edited after some concerns were raised by Nestle, which ultimately watered down the report. In fact, the report even changed their estimate of total child labor in the cocoa industry from the original draft of 2.1 million to the final report showing 1.56 million after meeting with these companies. The NORC report also declined to discuss child slavery, only referring to it all as child labor. But no amount of marketing or PR campaigns can dispute the facts, namely that the abuse of children in the cocoa industry has only increased in the years since the major players pledged to put an end to it. Now, the future of the chocolate industry is an uncertain one. Currently, if you're interested in buying chocolate whose production isn't tainted with child labor, you might be tempted to grab one with a certified label showing something along the lines of slavery-free or fair trade. But that doesn't tell the whole story. Fair Trade is an organization that was set up to provide cocoa farmers with a livable wage. The intent is to support the farmers and boost local economies, and to get certified and provided with the extra premiums, your farm has to be inspected and found to be child labor-free. However, there are a lot of different fair trade labels, and many of them are just outright fake. Essentially little more than a third-party sticker with no real meaning. It's only there to boost sales. True fair trade chocolate, such as the Dutch company Tony's Chocolonely, achieves their fair trade certification by paying a living wage premium, farmer bonuses, and matching the wages to local inflation. There are lots of other companies that do this as well and are legitimately certified, as several have popped up in recent years with the goals of providing exploitation-free cocoa products. But there are still a couple of problems here. The first problem is that these certified companies are by far the minority in the industry, and the corporate behemoths still control the vast majority of sales and thereby have the majority of the influence. The second issue is that even the certified fair trade labels might not be all they're chalked up to be. Charity Ryerson from the Corporate Accountability Lab investigated these supposed certified farms, and her results were rather shocking. She described that in many cases the certification is essentially meaningless, as first of all, the inspections are often announced ahead of time, giving the plantation owners time to clean up their act and appear prim and proper for visitors. Also, there was evidence of lying on the report, such as one checklist certifying that the bathrooms were clean, when in reality no bathrooms could be found on the premises. Finally, there's no guarantee that the fair trade premiums are actually ending up in the hands of the farmers themselves, as they're often skimmed out by higher-ups before reaching the bottom of the supply chain where they are most needed. Ryerson reported, quote, "We brought certified chocolate bars to villages where some or all farmers were certified. We held up the bar with the label and explained to the farmers what consumers expected out of the label. The overwhelming response of farmers to this information was shock and outrage. One farmer pulled his worn shirt out in front of him and asked if it looked like he was earning a decent living. Consultations revealed virtually imperceptible differences between certified and uncertified farms in terms of living incomes, poverty, education, access to healthcare, farmer bargaining power, or access to information." On that same note, a report from the University of Sheffield found that 95% of cocoa farmers in Ghana didn't even know if their workplace was certified or not. On top of all of this, even if cocoa beans are coming from a specific farm that is exploitation-free, there's no guarantee that these beans aren't getting mixed up with others at some point. Journalists revealed that the company Cooper Webb would receive bags from many different farms, open them all up, and mix them all together before shipping them to their big clients like Nestle and Mars, meaning that any supposed fair trade cocoa beans were now spread out amongst the rest. And funnily enough, Cooper Webb themselves were even fair trade certified at one point until they had their certification revoked for undisclosed reasons. At the end of the day, even honest cocoa farmers simply don't earn a living wage even when they're certified. This has led to the recent formation of the CIGCI, or Côte d'Ivoire Ghana Cocoa Initiative, which demands an extra premium for each ton of cocoa beans. The international opinion is quite negative about the initiative. An outlet such as The Economist lovingly wrote about it in a piece titled "Why the African Cocoa Cartel is a Bad Idea." The extra premium they're charging is known as an LID, or Living Income Differential. And even though it's only $400 extra per ton of cocoa beans, corporations are going out of their way to avoid paying it. In 2020, for example, Hershey's bought 30,000 tons on a special exchange to avoid the fee. But it's not like they can't afford it. It's just that they don't want to. After all, the industry is worth $130 billion. According to one report, for example, Ferrero makes enough profit to provide a living income for the 90,000 farmers that produce their beans and still have enough money left over for the Ferrero family to make more than $230 million a year. But they don't. And neither does Nestle, or Mars, or the other giants. And also, they can continue reaping the profits of exploitation. It is truly tragic that while children in the developed world have access to chocolate essentially whenever they please, most of the children farming it have never even tasted it.